Welcome to our 5 on 5. Please welcome back Senator Ron Wyden. Senator, thanks for coming.
Good to be back.
So gun control, of course, on the minds of many after El Paso and Dayton in the past week. Senate Leader Mitch McConnell and President Donald Trump don't support the bipartisan House bill already passed. Don't want to hear it in the Senate. How does this end?
Well, the message from Oregon is very clear. Oregonians are tired of meaningless words and they want meaningful action. And it really all starts on the floor of the United States Senate. And I'm in favor of Mitch McConnell bringing the Senate back. We ought to pass a background check bill that's loophole-free. And I don't see why, for example, terrorists and people on watch lists ought to be able to get guns.
Voter support for stricter gun laws is continually shown in polls of voters. A May Quinnipiac poll showed 61% support it, 34% oppose. Where do we find some common ground?
The victims of gun violence don't know any political party. This is just common sense. And there are a host of measures that ought to be included. I strongly favor making sure we can do research into gun violence, because I find when I'm doing town hall meetings in rural Oregon, very often the owners of gun shops know who shouldn't be getting guns. We ought to be doing basic research too.
Citing lies and impeachment, you wrote a guest editorial in the Oregonian this past week saying you now believe the House should investigate the president to determine whether to recommend articles of impeachment. What changed for you?
What changed, and it was a change after a great deal of thought, was Donald Trump has repeatedly said that he believes the Constitution gives him the power to do whatever he wants. And he said that recently. He's basically touched on it before. That is completely contrary to what the founding fathers had in mind. In fact, what our shaking free of the British was all about was limited government. And so, the idea that he can make whatever policy he wants with respect to war, that he can just decide to go to war with Iran, or border policy, or policy with respect to search and seizures. He's talking about changes that would allow the government to have access to our smartphones and all our personal data. He is not above the law, and I think that's what tipped me.
All right, we're going to take a quick commercial break. Much more in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to our 5 on 5. Getting here with Senator Ron Wyden. Senator, if we live where there are tornadoes, FEMA comes. If we live where there are hurricanes, that triggers FEMA. If we live in flood areas, FEMA is here. More and more fires becoming our trigger. Where's FEMA?
FEMA clearly has a role to play in emergencies. I have favored, for example, we almost have clean air refugees in the West. People who need emergency, health care. And I've also said in the case of senior citizens, they ought to have some help with shelter. Now, there is some good forestry news, coming up. In about 8 weeks, $650 million is going to be liberated under my law to end fire borrowing. And that's what I was talking about at Milepost 97. We're going to end fire borrowing and start focusing on prevention, prevention, prevention. And that's what those men and women at Milepost 97 were interested in.
You visited the U.S.-Mexico border recently. What stood out most to you?
What stood out most is that the administration seems to be narrowing the definition of family as a way to deter people from seeking refugee or asylee status. They knew they couldn't just go with regular family separation. So what they've done, for example, is accelerated stepping up, separating grandparents from grandchildren. I just don't think that's what American values are all about. My parents fled the Nazis, not all got out. All my dad believed in was America as a refuge. He was honored to serve in our military and fight the Nazis. He saw America as a refuge, and I always will too.
I know you've been working on drug prices in the Senate Finance Committee. Is anything being done to keep costs down?
Well, a positive development, and obviously folks in Southern Oregon believe they're getting mugged at the pharmacy counter when you talk about the price of insulin or cancer drugs. This kind of thing, sometimes they feel like they're making a mortgage payment for their prescription medicine. Chuck Grassley, he's the Republican from Iowa, and I have teamed up on a bill that got out of the Senate Finance Committee, and at least it's a beginning to this effort to hold down the cost of prescription drugs. The centerpiece is a measure that would say that the pharmaceutical companies if they raised their prices more than the rate of inflation, they would have to make a payment to Medicare. And the reason we were able to get it passed is this is not price controls. Nobody's setting prices here. We are limiting subsidies. And I think it's a beginning of a policy to finally help all those folks in Southern Oregon. And I hear it anytime I walk into a Fred Meyer, for example, in Southern Oregon. People say, Ron, what are they doing back there on pharmaceutical prices and getting them down? I think this bill with Senator Grassley makes a start.
I want to ask you about 2020. It's not far away.
I heard there was an election coming up.
There may be. We'll have to check the calendar on that. Is our election technology, our software, any safer coming into 2020 than it was?
Let me put it this way as a member of the Intelligence Committee. I will tell your viewers that as of today, with respect to hostile foreign actors, they are going to make what happens in 2020. It's going to make 2016 look like small potatoes. And there are some new developments. Just recently, you've got so many systems using outdated software. We still have systems, and there's just been a breaking story today that have open connections to the internet. Now, if you have voting machines with an open connection to the internet, that is just like putting American ballot boxes on the streets of Moscow. That's a brand new development just in the last 24 hours.
Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, stay with us. We'll be right back.